Hello YouTube, just a quick video to show you how to replace or repair a crack in gone plaster, off plaster. This is my son's room and this plaster is definitely off. It's a very old 1930s building, so to be honest, if I tackled any wall, I imagine most of the plaster would fall off. So it's not something I really want to do, is to replaster the whole wall. So I'm not sure how much is going to come off. I could gamble just taking out a whole section. Or I could try and repair the cracks, as you can see. So we will see, like, that whole thing can come off there. So we'll see what develops and how much needs to come off. I'm thinking probably just where the cracks are in the centre bit here. I mean, if the plaster wasn't gone, you'd basically just tackle the actual crack, open it up, put some PVA glue in and replaster. But as you can see, the whole thing there is ready to come down. So I think probably a large section will. So these are the tools I'll be using. I don't want to go too hard at this because I think this whole thing could come down and I don't really want to have to replace the whole wall. So I'm going to slowly work away at these cracks, and then there'll be a point where I'm happy that it stays. Like there, it's not too bad there. So probably, as you can hear, probably around there-ish I'll be going, and it's probably quite a good when that can all go. So it's going to be this whole section here. If you find yourself in this situation, just slowly work away at the cracks and just see how far you're willing to go. I mean, if I drip in PVA glue behind this as a bit closer, I imagine it will fix some of the problems. It will glue it to the wall, but you obviously want to solve the problem without causing too much of a DIY headache. So this is the centre of the problem here. All the cracks gravitate out. I'm just going to slowly work away, and then at some point I'll let you know where I'm happy to stop, and then we'll be treating it and I'll show you what we do from that. As you can see here, when you get that kind of hollow sound, it's because the plaster is so old, it comes away from the wall. So it's so hollow. So it's still, it's still rigid, it still does its job, but it's come away from the wall, which creates that hollow sound. Don't even need a chisel. And there we go. So you see, you get to this bit here and it's still quite tight to the wall. I mean, this would still come off pretty easily, but I don't want to make too much of a big job of this. So where that's tight to the wall, I'm quite happy. Here, still blown from the wall, so we're going to continue going there. And this is what we're aiming for, a nice tight gap there. So what you'll find that happens is that as you're peeling away some of the plaster, it will pull it away. So it's pulled the bit that was nice and tight here, because I was working on this plaster over here, it's pulled it away. Now obviously all this plaster could come down, but you've got to make a decision where you're stopping. So I'm now going to continue, because I pulled that away, and actually cut in a line here, so that when I'm pulling this plaster, it's not then going to pivot or pull off this plaster down here. So I think that's what I'll be doing all the way around. And hopefully that won't cause too much disruption to the rest of the plaster. So as you can see here, I've done like a little cut in the plaster here. If you then work this away, that shouldn't disrupt the plaster below. And then we have a nice gap there that's not going to be disturbed. Now if I hadn't done that and I'd forced this out, it would have forced that out as well. So again, we've done like a little line down here. All the plaster's okay-ish down at this line. This is all blown above it, so to prevent any further issues, that just comes down without affecting the plaster that we're going to keep. You can see it comes down easy. It comes down on those crack lines as well. What I'm going to do, where the cracks extend beyond where I'm going to repair, I'm just going to open up the crack. As you can see, there's one there. I don't want to go that low, so I want to keep the level. So I need to keep some of the plaster as a level for the plastering I'm going to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this crack like that, and then we're going to put some glue in there, PVA glue, as you'll see shortly, and plaster that, and hopefully that crack should go then. So here I've reached my level, which I'm happy to stop on. All this plaster could easily come off, but it's not blown against the wall, so we're going to keep that. So that's my level there, as you can see, there's a crack that continues. So again, I'm just going to open up that crack, and we'll be putting some glue in there once that's opened up. So same principle now. Now I've reached my level, I don't want this now to affect this coming off. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to cut a line in up here and then keep going until I've decided I'm happy I've got to the point where it's not blown. Now this is the hardest bit, where you've got to show some sort of restraint, because you can just keep on going. Like I could nip this bit off, it causes a crack. I nick that bit off, causes a crack. So at some point you have to just stop. Now luckily down here, all of this, none of it is against, it's all against the wall. So we're going to keep all this. I'm not going to do any more work around here. I've got a crack here. If I started working that, this whole thing would come down. And you just go on and on and on. There's a few bits where you're thinking, well, what's the point? This seems to be crumbling away quite a lot. So what is the point keeping this bit in the middle when I've got two cracks I'm trying to open up there? So I probably will take that down. And the issue that I'm thinking of is trying to keep the same level, but because I've got this here and this here, I can keep that bit level. And obviously the further you go, the harder that's going to be to make that level, or just to make it easy anyway. So I'm probably going to remove this bit. I might have a look at this crack here, because I've gone down there. These cracks I've dug out, so I'm not going to go any further there, and that is it, hopefully. So that is me done. I'm happy with all of that. All of the edges are as flat as they can be. What we need to do now is make sure we can kind of assist it where we can. So we use PVA. Now I'm not sure the exact mix, but I'm just going to use 50-50, 50 PVA, 50 water, to seal in those joints, and obviously seal the back, so you don't want too much moisture being absorbed from the plaster too quickly, but obviously it'll also seal in anything that's loose, so we can get it dripping down the back. It should hopefully seal it. So that is next on the list. So the next stage is to PVA the wall to seal it, and to kind of hope kind of get some of the mortar back adhered back to the wall and prevent any further cracks. So I'm not sure the exact mix, but I'm just going to put about 50-50 in. And then oh, it's a bit old, this glue. So you can do roughly a 50-50 mix with glue and water. That also bonds the wall, so when I plaster it, it doesn't absorb too much moisture too quickly, but also seals it as well. So you want to make sure those seals where we're not going to take the mortar off are adhered to the wall as much as possible. So that should be about enough. Just a bit of water. I'm just going to paintbrush it on. So it's kind of like a nice milk consistency, and I'm just going to let it drip down. It's going to seal that back wall, but these edges here I really want sealed, so that glue should absorb into that boundary and kind of further adhere it to the wall. Hopefully it will go down and penetrate a bit further. Like I said, you know, this whole wall could come down realistically, but with these old buildings, I mean, do you really want to take down every single bit of plaster? Aesthetically it looks fine. It would come down with a bit of a bang, but there's areas that do need to come out like that, blown bit of plaster. Other areas will be fine for a number of years yet. And then the main in these cracks, I dug down quite deep, because where that plaster is cracked, hopefully this will absorb in and prevent any further cracks, so when I replaster it, a crack won't reappear. So if you only had a few cracks and your plaster wasn't blown, you could actually do all of your cracks like this without chopping away massive amounts of plaster. You just dig out the cracks and PVA it, and then replaster over. So that's all the PVA glue applied. I'm going to let that dry now, and then we'll see, you probably see through the video how secure that's going to be. It should absorb into where the porous plaster is, and then keep that nice and flush against the wall. So we'll probably finish this off tomorrow. So this is all dry now, so as you can see the glue has kind of penetrated the old plaster and just done a final seal, which all looks good. And if you give it a knock, I think it's penetrated further than what you can see, because none of this sounds off. There's a few hollows, but nowhere near as bad as before. which is the kind of sound you're looking for, which is perfect. So that glue's gone in, it's sealed the back, stopped kind of any dust. It's going to create a membrane where it's not going to absorb too much moisture. It's sealed the edges of the plaster, and now it's time to start building up the bonding coat. So I have a bonding coat on here, which is going to be about 1 centimetre and a bit, maybe 1.5 centimetres thick. And then there's going to be a bonding coat, a bonding coat first, then a finished coat, which is like about 1 millimetre thick, to bring it all in line with the rest of the wall. Time for bonding coat. So the bonding coat's all mixed up, and this is the kind of consistency you want. So it's like really sticky mud, basically. So that's going to stick quite easily to the wall. The key really for good plastering, if you're not going to use plastering board, is to get the bonding coat as flat as possible. You spend all your effort trying to get that flat, because then the finished coat will just basically skim on. You don't have to worry about trying to kind of fill any voids or gaps or anything like that. That should literally just be the final 1 millimetre coat to keep it flat. So it's really important to get the bonding coat flat. So it's a bit easier in this regard, because we're going to have these two sides of the wall as reference to keep it flat. So the way in which I'm going to do that, you obviously get a whole load of different trowels, but I've got my hawk over there, a standard trowel. You obviously can use it easily cleaning up a little bit, but a kind of longer trowel for leveling. I use a smaller one sometimes just because I prefer using that. But ultimately, what I'll use on this job is this straight edge. So that will span the distance between the two, and I'll completely level it, which is why, this is the reason why I didn't want to take off too much plaster either edge, because I want to use those as a guide to keeping the rest flat. If you imagine without that, what you can do is put 2 timbers up and use the timber to keep it flat. You can do it by eye and just keep on using the straight edge to get it flat. There are a number of different ways, but because this is only a small fix-it job, I want to use those sides to keep it level. So I'll use that as a straight edge like that, and just pull it up and keep it level, and then I'll scrape back a little bit so I've got enough depth for my finish coat. So you'll see that as I go through the process. And that's the bonding coat on. It's pretty much all there, what is all there. Obviously I'm going to finish it off with the finished coat tomorrow. Just done some little marks on there, so it helps with the adherence between the finished coat and the bonding coat. I let my kids help me out, so it's quite a messy job today, but yeah, pretty much there. I'm happy with the plaster that we've left. The cracks are filled in quite nicely. It's a nice little layer of bonding coat, which will be dry by tomorrow, and then finish coat and painting. So we have our finished plaster all mixed up. What you're looking for is kind of like a mousse texture. So it's very, very loose, because you can try and get it as flat as possible. So pretty much like a mousse. And then start applying. One thing it's very important to do is to have a clean bucket, because you get any little bit of gravel in there, you make a nice glass finish, and that bit of gravel will just ruin it. It'll pull it all the way across, and it just kind of gets irritating. You've got to pull them all out, and it affects the finish. So you want the bucket as clean as possible, and same for the work surface space. You want that all to be kind of crumb free. So what I've done here, there's only so much you can do. I've got quite a rough bonding, because I want it to bond quite firm. So I've gone over it with a scraper just to get all the loose bits off, because they're going to cause me problems when I start putting on the finish coat. Now, one thing that's really important to do is to keep your work surface wet. If you apply plaster to dry bonding coat, then it's just going to absorb all the moisture, and it's going to dry up really quickly, so you're not going to have time to work it. So apply liberal amounts of water to the area that you're going to plaster initially, So you limit that drying out time and you can work with it and try and get it as flat as possible. That's the first layer on. I will admit it hasn't gone perfectly because I've not plastered on bonding coat for quite a while. I've plastered on plasterboard, and the bonding coat absorbs the moisture almost immediately. So you have less than a minute to work with it, which is not ideal at all. It's not how it should work. So I probably should have put a bonding coat of PVA glue on the bonding coat of plaster. It just pulled all the water out. Even when I wetted the bonding coat of plaster, it still pulled too much moisture out, which just doesn't give you enough time to work with it. That's not the case when you work with plasterboard, which I've worked with recently. Bonding coat I haven't worked for a while. So yeah, in future or for your projects, bond what you're going to put the bonding coat on with the PVA glue, and put bonding coat of PVA glue on your primary bonding coat of plaster. To avoid that moisture. What you're aiming for really is to get the whole area covered in plaster to a roughly roughly uniformed thickness, and then work with it. So you want to be working with it for a good 15 minutes. This was dried out almost unworkable within a minute, so it shows you how important it is to use in-date plaster. That'll go off really quickly, or to make sure that your the surface you're painting on is not too porous, so it won't pull out too much of the moisture. So it's still workable, I can still get around it, but it's not the ideal situation. So I put one more coat and we should be done. Okay, we're all done for now. Just need to do the undercoat painting and then the overcoat painting. It was a lot harder. I haven't done any plastering for a while, but it was a bit of a nightmare just because the amount of plaster that was drying so quickly. It was drying really quickly. Even the coat that I put on the finish coat, so I had like 3 or 4 layers on this. I thought that would stay moist for longer, but it was just drying at a rate of knots. Now that all normally only happens when the plaster is contaminated, if it's old plaster, and obviously if you put it onto a porous wall, which I initially did, but obviously the subsequent layers weren't. They were on wet plaster, but it's drying so quickly it's almost impossible to manage to kind of work. So I've got to put that down to the fact that the whole thing was porous. That because I didn't seal the bonding coat, it's continually absorbed moisture because the actual plaster in the bucket was staying wet, but as soon as it went on the wall it didn't. So it's a good lesson. It doesn't seem to be an issue with plasterboard, and obviously most properties these days are plasterboard, but when you're using bonding coat plaster, it will literally absorb the water at the rate of knots, making it impossible. So you have to bond not only the wall when you first put the bonding coat on, but obviously the bonding coat afterwards, and that way it's workable for longer, and you can get it flat. It is manageable without, but I had to do 3 or 4 layers to get it this flat, to compensate for the fact that it was absorbing so much moisture. So I'll do another little check tomorrow to make sure it's all in order, give it a paint, and that's it. So it's quite a big job in the end, but obviously all that plaster was off. You wouldn't have to do that much if it's just a few cracks, but I'm quite happy with the amount I've taken off, and you'll see when it's painted, you'd never know it was there. So that was a great little project, and thank you for watching.